What's up, guys, and welcome to this very first podcast episode on my YouTube channel. I am really excited to release this video, as we have some brilliant minds today who are going to talk about AI DAOs, which is a topic or a space as well in the blockchain space that is evolving quickly, and a lot of people are not aware of it still. And it's highly interesting, and the people such as Trent McConaghy, who is the founder of the Ocean Protocol, Michael Zargham, who is the CEO of BlockScience, Robert Miller, who is a DAO enthusiast, and also he's going to talk about FlashBots. So a very interesting topic as well. You should not miss that one. That's really fascinating to be honest. And Paul Kohlhaas, who is the founder of the Molecule protocol and the co-initiator of VitaDAO, and he's also going to moderate it, as my knowledge is simply limited when it comes to AI DAOs or DAOs in general. So I was basically observing what those brilliant minds had to say about it. So stick around, and don't forget to subscribe, comment, like, all the things which just really pushes content on YouTube. It's just how it works, and I would really appreciate that in order to push out more of this kind of content. And yeah, with that being said, let's just jump straight into it. And I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, see you in there. So I will just quickly and briefly introduce all of you, and then we go from Paul. He is going to moderate today. And I'm really looking forward to learn a lot from you guys as well, since this is a new space for me. I have been reading up a bit, especially your blog post, Trent. And yes, I'm really looking forward to learn much more about this space, since it is evolving quickly and yeah, I guess needed as well. So quickly to myself, my name is Steven Zuber. I am a former professional filmmaker, and I got down the rabbit hole of crypto in 2017. Made a bit of money, and then the bubble popped, and then I lost the money again. And then I started to basically just understand the space a bit more. And now I'm just really sucked into it, and yeah, cannot really leave it without thinking about it too much. So
Stephen has been a very big, long-time supporter of Ocean as well.
yes, that's true. So yeah, I would like to start with you, Trent, as a introduction quickly. You are the founder of Ocean Protocol, which is a marketplace for data and AI. You have been writing about AI since 2016 and pioneering the exciting Nature 2.0 movement. And you have been digging into AI since 20 years, I think. So you know a lot about the space. Then we have Michael Zargham. He is the CEO of BlockScience and one of the most rigorous academics and system design thinkers in the Web3 space. They are creating simulation tools like CAD, if I pronounce that correctly.
CAD, yeah, it's
CAD.
the same thing twice.
CAD, okay, cool. For tokens and governance systems. And then we have Robert Miller, who is a longtime DAO enthusiast. Previously, he was at Consensus Health, and now pioneering the FlashBots movement, arguably one of the most exciting bot movements in the DeFi space right now. And last but not least, we got Paul Kohlhaas. He is a long-term friend of mine. We went to school together when we were younger. He's the founder of Molecule. He's building a marketplace for decentralized drug development, and now VitaDAO, which is the first drug development DAO, basically. And Paul also wrote about AI DAOs in 2016 and recently kicked off a Twitter thread who brought us all here today. So with all that being said, I would like to pass it on to you guys and learn as much as I can today. Thank you for being here.
Awesome, Stephen. Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Yeah, also to all of you guys, thank you so much for being here. Thanks also to Twitter for bringing us together. I find it really amazing how serendipitous conversations on Twitter can spark great minds to come together. Yes, I think for me, this goal, the goal of this conversation was really to reignite a broader conversation around AI DAOs. It's actually also thanks to Zargham. I think the Twitter thread kind of started branching out into different directions. The conversation very quickly became quite sophisticated. Maybe to anyone who will be listening to this afterwards, we'll just post a thread if you want to read up on that. So we have a couple of topics maybe that we can start with. So the way that we can structure the conversation is I'd like all of us to maybe start out with an initial. So maybe this conversation started out in terms of differentiating between how humans run DAOs, and there's an enormous need for more humans to run DAOs at the moment. It's something that we're experiencing. It's very difficult to manage DAOs that are emerging. But then it's a question actually, how human-centric do DAOs actually need to be? And maybe we start out with the definition what a DAO actually is to all of us, so that we have the right basis to start from.
I'd
Trent?
be happy to.
Oh yeah, Zargham?
No worries. I was gonna say, so actually after having a good chunk of time on term disambiguation, at least for me, I look at DAOs in terms of their political philosophical terminology, because both decentralized and autonomous with respect to the noun organizations, I would generally interpret as referring to the sort of autonomy is autonomy from, or sort of outward looking at other entities, institutions, or jurisdictions, but you have sort of you have a separate agency from other things. Doesn't necessarily mean completely, but we often use the term for things like autonomous zones, and decentralization tends to refer to, as you would expect, the sort of distribution of political power across sort of many actors, or it's not particularly concentrated. But the terminology in a sort of more social scientist context is pretty well defined. And in my experience, a lot of the muddling comes from the mixture of those terms with something like, distributed in the physical, like distributed computing sense. I have a bunch of different machines versus, say, autonomy in the sense of like autonomous dynamical systems, no input from the outside. And it's amazing how much this sort of semantic collisions in those terms from different fields has led to confusion. And so, at least personally, I use DAOs in the political philosophy realm, because again, the word organization seems like it's the thing being modified, but I'll sort of acknowledge the fact that the decentralization and autonomy may have, and we often choose to use more technically sourced definitions of the term as well.
I can jump in on what is the definition of a DAO. Like Zargham, actually, I think philosophically around definitions, one must be careful. And so my general approach on definitions, whether it's a definition for AI or blockchain or otherwise, is to give a bunch of different definitions. And in this context here, I'm not going to give a bunch. I'm just going to give one definition with the understanding that there can be many definitions. And they often kind of couple together. There's sort of this cluster to give a general idea of the thing. And even if you think about it, even dictionaries give a bunch of definitions for any one word. So that's okay, right? And so for this context of this conversation, I'm going to define DAO as a life form that can coordinate humans, AIs, or both. And coordinate is probably the key word here, in the sense of, some entity that can basically fight Moloch, fight this, God. That fight is against coordination. So overall, it's basically fight the good fight such that we can coordinate well, right? And life form as in some, entity that has some degree of sovereignty and autonomousness, etc. Right? So DAO, a life form that can coordinate humans, AIs, or both.
I don't think I have too much more to add beyond what Trent and Zargham added. So I will defer to them on the definition of a DAO.
I'll go from my side. I think it could be any like non-incorporated entity at the moment that we're witnessing in these Web3 networks. I find it really interesting that many DeFi protocols have essentially decided to DAOify themselves instead of remaining as traditionally incorporated companies. I think we could have seen many of these DeFi startups emerge as like VC-funded startups that launched the same exact product and protocol, but they instead decided to DAOify themselves. I'll keep with a very narrow definition of what I consider a DAO today, which are really the DAOs that we're seeing actively operate on Ethereum and kind of use that emerging DAO tooling stack. But I fully agree with Trent that the actual definition of what it can be is very wide. And then, I mean, if it's a life form, you could even go as far as saying, are organisms DAOs in their own right? I mean, there's certain biological organisms that you could classify as DAOs in that sense. But
it's autopoiesis.
Yeah. And
that's the thing that we have in common with what we said is sorry.
Well put, actually. Yeah, and vice versa, right? Like Ralph Merkle has talked about Bitcoin as a life form, and to that, I fully agree, right? I've talked with people, leaders of the artificial life field and stuff. What's a life form? All that, and you know, with their definition and so on, they agree, as well as people from like Santa Fe Institute, Complexity Science experts, etc. And they love this definition of Bitcoin as a life form, DAOs as life forms, and so on, because it's totally in line with their thinking and their study of complex systems.
Autopoiesis is this concept that relates to a thing that is constantly in the process of creating itself, including new components. And actually, I really love it as a term for DAOs in relation to life forms, because the really fun DAOs to participate in are not actually just like grinding through in a sort of mechanistic way. They're like creating new elements, and maybe you even get this sort of ship of Theseus-like effect where the people flow through over time, but it's still the same DAO and it's grown in a way that's meaningful. New parts have been created. And so there's very life-esque feelings around it. I think that's a really powerful way to build an intuition for DAOs. I will say that one of our challenges is managing the difference between what we're currently experiencing and sort of what we see as possible.
Do you all think that markets are an example of DAOs? You're referring to like coordination mechanisms that are evolving over time, and that immediately makes me think of a market. So does a market qualify as a DAO, or is there like some specific technical instantiation that is needed to make something a DAO?
In the broadest definition, I'll give it to you. I think that kind of the challenge, right? We're looking at this spectrum of definitions. And
maybe a question to all of you. Just building on what you said, Zargham, is Ethereum a DAO already at this point?
What are you talking about? Ethereum, the sort of meta entity, or Ethereum, the protocol?
Like the organism. If you talk about autopoiesis and a self-perpetuating system, then.
So I want to say yes. I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think the issue is where you draw the lines when you say Ethereum. If Ethereum is the people and the processes, including the informal processes, the norms, the culture, like everything that make it up, then absolutely. But I think we got to be really careful. It's not the EF. It's not the physical technical infrastructure, because the growth and sort of changes to that infrastructure are encapsulated in this like life version of DAO.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Zargham on that. And to riff on this, if you think about the definition of life, that is actually a controversial thing too. So I remember a conversation I had with a person who ran the Artificial Life Journal, scientific journal, and he gave me a wonderful way to think about it. He said, Trent, there's a checklist of like 20 things. And if something has like at least 10 of those 20 things on that checklist, then it's definitely a life form, right? Like we as an individual human are definitely life forms. A whole city itself is definitely a life form. But, if you only have 1 or 2 items on that checklist, it's definitely not a life form, right? And some of these checklists are things like, okay, is it autonomous? Does it have some simple decision-making? Does it have fancy decision-making? Can it make babies, et cetera, right? And if you have something sort of like, say, 7 or 8 items in that checklist, it's sort of kind of maybe, right? It depends who you ask, right? So, and then this applies, you know, in the world of artificial life, there's a lot of people that were saying they were creating artificial life inside a computer, and maybe it would have 5 or 7 checks. Some people would agree that it's artificial life. Other people would say, no, it's not. And it's somewhere in between. Or like, you know, Craig Venter famously synthesized life. He said he did, right? But it was also one of those things like 7 of the 20 checklists. So it was controversial, right? So the sort of the toy wagon definition of life, you know, maybe 3 or 4 things, and then the full on, super bus or something, 12 or 15. And this is kind of why partly I put the definition of the word life into definition of DAO, where, you know, once again, it's a life form that can coordinate humans, AIs, or both, because life form itself is a little bit ambiguous. It's a bit controversial, but there's a framework to think about it with this sort of checklist framing, right? And I think that's valuable. So, you know, going back to the example, the question that you had, Paul, is Ethereum a life form? Well, in the broader sense, like Zargham said, yes, because it checks off many, many of those items, right? In the narrow sense, no, because it doesn't, right?
So just touching on that and kind of moving the conversation on a little bit. So what happens if let's remove humans from these life forms? And that then brings, I think, to one of the first framings that came up in our Twitter thread, really AI as navigation systems. If we think of a Tesla running on autopilot, that's a navigation system driving my car. So what happens if we remove humans from these type of organizations? And I think that's really the kind of then the next yeah.
I think the problem is that, like, if you remove humans in what sense? Because, like, on one hand, if we're taking our life form definition, we can have let's call it a human orthogonal DAO, one where the DAO is only to Trent's point, only coordinating other AIs, and so then you have like a almost accelerando like case where there's a DAO coordinating other AIs in a closed life qualifying system. I'm kind of like, sure, but maybe less interested, and I'm looking at things that are, interesting intersections of humans and algorithms, in which case I would say removing humans is, I don't want to say uninteresting, but it's concerning, because ultimately AIs live in this sort of constraints and objectives framework. And if you're a human and you're subjected to the solution to the optimization problem for which you're not feeding information, that's your canonical oppression status. That's I don't have a say on the decisions this thing takes, and I have them held over me. And so, as a rule, I tend to look at it as, even if these are super smart AI DAOs, lots of coordination is done by algorithms that ultimately you need to give humans some say over the optimization problem being solved, the objectives and the metrics and the constraints. Otherwise, I kind of consider it like sort of Skynet danger zone.
I can riff on that for sure. The Nick Bostrom paperclip maximizer is the classic problem, right? Where you give an AI a bunch of resources and you say, go and make paperclips, and then it's somehow it does such a good job that it consumes every single atom on planet Earth to make paperclips, right? And you can view Bitcoin as a paperclip maximizer for energy, right? It's like objective function is maximize security, which comes down to right now maximize energy. If you assume that everyone is using, the most, competitive chips they can, et cetera, right? Which is a problem, but I don't think it's, I view that as simply a really great illustrator that, blockchains are incentive machines rather than a vote against blockchain, because there's now, more energy efficient ways to approach blockchain, et cetera, right? But for this problem of this question of AIs as navigation systems, I'm kind of actually a lot in agreement with Zargham in that it's kind of an interesting question, but not really. We have to be like, I think there's much more interesting questions. AIs, they can, but I will say, if you have an objective function or a set of objectives and constraints that you then get this DAO or AI DAO to go and optimize for, be careful. Because it might get it, and then you have another paperclip maximizer. And maybe in a good way or maybe in a bad way, probably a bit of both. You can actually have AIs that just optimize for novelty, right? It's not even an objective function, that's novelty search. And it's a radically fascinating field, right? It's basically going for interestingness. But is that better? Is that worse? Who knows, right? But once it's kind of, unbounded out of control, in the words of Kevin Kelly or whatever, then it's like, you've got something more full on nature, more full on like life, right? But we don't control nature either. Nature is largely benevolent to us, but tornadoes and tsunamis still kill a bunch of people.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, to tie your example back to the Ethereum question, is when we see ourselves or the entity itself changing course in a meaningful way. So you look at the transition from proof of work to proof of stake as a sort of the institution or the life form. Ethereum is being like, oh no, we're like destroying our whatever resource pool. Let us go over here and do something different. And that change in sort of higher order behavior, even if it's at the large sort of institutional organism scale, is one, evidence of life, evidence of DAO-ness in this case, but also kind of I don't know whether it's the counterpoint or the point, but basically we're saying, hey, look, it somehow changed its objective function. Or if it was security and consuming power, now it's like, well, we want security, but we're going to consume this other resource and we're going to do it this other way. And it's that higher order change for me that is both evidence of life and of sort of DAO-ness, and also underpins it can be sort of artificially or collectively intelligent without actually having to be, purely AI in the way we think of the machines, as making the ultimate decisions.
The interesting thing about that is it's not at all clear that that's going to be a clean split. Like, I think that the Ethereum proof of stake chain is going to exist, and the proof of work chain probably will too. And there are like individual components of the Ethereum ecosystem today where there will be two parts, and there will be like this great battle to figure out which part is valid or not. For example, think of all the tether that exists on the Ethereum chain today. Like, is that going to, does Tether as the organism within the broader Ethereum ecosystem decide to go with the proof of work or the proof of stake chain? And there will be this tension and weird battle that goes on.
Maybe tying right into that. So I think there's one example of a chain, I think launching on Friday officially, which is Definity, which is integrated like AI at the base layer, or at least like with their central nervous system. I don't know how deep you guys are in that, but maybe as a general concept, what do you think of that idea of integrating AI at a protocol governance level to deal with some of these upcoming challenges? And I know maybe also right now, I think we're very high on like let's say a layer 1 level. Would love us to also begin going like deeper on like layer 2, kind of almost like application levels. But yeah, very curious what you think on like AI governance at a protocol level.
What do you bake into the protocol level that constitutes AI? Because generally framing AI problems is far more important. Like solving them is whatever, like framing them is where the solutions come from. Like they're hard to frame.
So for example, and this is actually maybe an interesting, looking back at the history of Ethereum, I think what also the reason we're having this conversation is because of the DAO, which was famously launched on Ethereum, I think it was April 2016. Some of us, I certainly put in some Ether, was a very interesting time. The DAO famously blew up. And then that actually led to a fork, returning everyone their funds that had participated in this experiment. It was a very contentious fork. It led to the creation of ETC. And I think, so Definity was being developed at the time, and it was a leading factor for Definity to say, we need on-chain automated governance that can make these decisions and do these callbacks, because humans can't do them well enough. And it leads to massive splits in communities. So maybe that could be, would that be a research question?
But that's a completely normative. There's the issue is that at the end of the day, that was a philosophical, normative, like political choice. And the reason that it resulted in a fork is because people had different, bases of belief, for lack of a better term. So like you get and actually to go to what Robert was starting to say, I actually really like it, sort of. I know it sounds weird when things split, because I think of it as a biologic reproduction. Now, like some of the things might die off, but if you want to think of this as life, then when there's sufficient differences in what the humans believe in a code-based system, then like forking is your sort of governance of last resort, and it creates this cool thing where you can think of the code as like the DNA, but then the actual like life of the thing is the people involved in it, the attention, the participation, etc. And so when you sort of fork the code and kind of two communities sort of emerge from the base, you really do have something that you can envisage like a mitosis process, like a asexual reproduction, because the code splits and then there's like some overlap in the sort of nucleus in the sort of people involved, and they kind of continue to split, and eventually you get two almost completely distinct communities. And maybe one dies off, maybe the other dies off, maybe they both thrive, maybe they continue to battle with each other, who knows? But you've gone from having one organism to two. And since we're talking about this in the life analogy, I do think it's super relevant. But I would go back to and challenge the idea that that's something that could have a judgment that could have been rendered by an AI, because in the worst case or best case, the AI would have to be trained to render judgments according to a bunch of base cases, and then it would render a judgment, and it's still the training set that you trained it with is subjective, or the objective function you gave it to, and features you gave it to evaluate the case would be, that you're just like hiding the power in the person who built the AI system that was responsible for making that that discernment.
Yeah, so I put all of this into simply an evolutionary framing, including the discussion on the fork of ETC out of ETH, including proof of work staying around, proof of stake, etc. So in an evolutionary framing, you can have you have competition for resources among a bunch of individuals at the lower level, and if at some point there can be some new opportunity, a new piece of environment that some specialization will help if you go there. And so there might be some mutations and some things that happen in those individuals that then some of them specialize in that niche and then they flourish in that niche, right? Might be a different island in the Galapagos, or might be, crossing the mountains to California or whatever, and you get new life forms, etc. And that's all sort of on one evolutionary plane, but then you can go meta hierarchical up and up and up. You have something at, we started with single cell organisms, then went to multi-celled, and then higher and higher levels. And those single cell organisms are all still around. We've just got more and more complexity, or entropy reduction by organizing at higher and higher levels of hierarchy. And I see what happened even in the split to ETC and stuff. That was basically some higher level emergent sort of actions that were being taken and causing the split to this new evolutionary niche, right? And it will probably happen for sure. I would be surprised if it didn't actually in the move to POS as well, right? And then, with this, of course, how do you come up with new, proposals for life forms at the level of blockchain protocol and stuff? It can be, completely random, just someone evolves something, but of course you can have human design in there to intervene, and that's fine. And that's what I see Definity as, right? So with their blockchain, they happen to have drawing on ideas from AI in order to help some of the lower level governance decisions on their blockchain. Will that be evolutionary successful? We will see, right? And no more, no less, right? But I don't see it, like, to me, humans aren't that special, right? I don't see that there's sort of everything else, and then there's humans. To me, there's a bunch of different life forms out there, and even more generally, entropy reducing mechanisms, if you will. And humans happen to be really good at reducing entropy to the point where we become the most successful species on the planet. But we should get off our high horses and give space to other entities that can also reduce entropy well, that can compress information well, etc. And we're starting to see a lot more entities like this on silicon-based substrates, right? And so let's give space to it, because they could make our lives better, for starters. And some of them might end up being some of the more dominant species in terms of using resources. And we should embrace that, in my view.
So going to something Robert said earlier, and maybe it was offhand, but he mentioned markets. And I want to point out that these species that Trent's talking about are kind of, at least in my mind, very much down to where you draw the lines in the sort of system sense. So like you've got spatial temporal scales. So you've got, stuff and decision making and space and time. And ultimately, if you want to see organisms in different spatial scales, sometimes you zoom out and you see a city, or you see, we talk about Ethereum here, but we also have to think about the characteristic time scale of those organizations, and to understand that, in this example of Definity, it may be that some of the low level sort of micro decisions are becoming increasingly automated, but then you might have, other time scales in which the decision making capacity might look different through an interaction maybe between the algorithms and human behavior. But we come back to markets, like one question might be, over what space and time, dotted line slice can we envision a market as a living thing, or in this example a DAO? And I was thinking about it as you said it, and I think that might start to look at like, okay, well, we might have to pay attention to what resources the market is coordinating, and how it's sort of, how those resources are applied and how it sustains itself, and over what time scales it makes meaningful changes in allocations. And I bet that I won't say like every market just because keyword market, but more in the sense that, if we zoom in on even maybe more localized markets that manage specific resources in a community, say, you start to see how that market is actually a kind of living thing in a certain sort of spatial temporal sense. And I tend to advocate for us reasoning about things beyond human centric, as Trent says, but actually I tend to find you discover different concepts if you change your frame of reference in terms of, spatial, what's included in your model, your mental model, or even formal model, and what time scale you look at it evolving over. And you can find things that check these life lists and maybe get from 7 to 10 just by reimagining what scale you're looking at it on.
I want to move the conversation a little bit from like a systems level to maybe like an agent level. And actually, so one really interesting project that I came across was Autonomous. And then Trent, I also think you wrote things about the art DAO. Other really emergent, interesting, I think, behavior is bot behavior that we're seeing on Ethereum. What are some interesting examples that you guys would like to discuss that you're currently seeing out in the wild of like AI DAO like agent behavior, not on a systems level, but really on an agent level?
Well, I'm going to directly defer to Robert, because to me, by far the most interesting is the Dark Forest MEV stuff. The other art stuff is really cool, but the Dark Forest stuff is next level. Like that's so clearly AI DAO stuff, right? In my view.
I mean, yeah, I'm happy to like maybe give some context for your readers too. So on Ethereum today, and then to a lesser extent, other blockchains as well, there are a bunch of bot operators, including myself, that will run software in the cloud somewhere that identifies opportunities to be able to make some value if they can place transactions in very specific orders on Ethereum. For example, if you see the price of an asset really high on Uniswap and really low on Curve, then there's some way that you can buy and sell these things in order to capture value. And there are all of these different games that you can play on Ethereum in order to capture value in this way with like the various different financial system components. And we've seen just this.
If I can just add something, this has been, I mean, in a centralized way, this has been happening for years, right? People have just been arbing between different crypto exchanges, but now this is being fully decentralized, which is what's incredibly fascinating. Yeah. Back to you, Robert. Sorry.
We've just seen this exponential increase in the level of complexity that's been going on, and a little bit of the movement into the decentralized world as well. So one of the, I think, really interesting emergent behaviors that you're referring to in the Dark Forest was a sandwich bot, which is someone that gives other users worse prices by getting in front of them and then selling after them, had their transactions placed in an Ethereum uncle block. So if you produce 2 blocks at the same time, or if 2 miners produce blocks at the same time, one of them needs to be discarded to the side, and then one of them ends up being a canonical chain. And so this bot had their transactions placed in an uncle, which is normally discarded. And another bot saw that this uncle bot had their transactions placed and was able to take them from the uncle block and put them in the main canonical chain and extract some value from the other bot in the uncle block. And to me, this was just like an amazing example of the extreme complexities of the system and the level of sophistication, and also the speed of iteration of these bots happening. Like, there was a bot that was exploited not only because of an action that it took on the main chain, but an action that was even in an uncle block, which I don't think a single person beyond this bot operator was really thinking of. And so sort of the quip is that the monsters of the dark forest of the Ethereum mempool will find you and get you, but it turns out that the monsters of the dark forest extend past the dark forest and into uncle blocks as well. And I think that's just a great example of this emergent intelligence that you see from bot operators.
Can I ask you a question too? I know there was recently a lot of really entertaining emergence of, bots that attack bots, and I tended to interpret this as an immune system type response, where like, this world evolved. I don't know, like, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. Like the bot on bot action is particularly interesting in a biological framing.
Yeah, and it is interesting because the bots that have been attacked are some of the more unsavory ones as well. Like, sandwich bots take pending users' transactions and they are able to extract some value from them. And so people just hate that this happens. And retail users lose a lot of money because they don't know how to defend against these things. And that has been like the bot on bot violence, has been sandwich bot operators getting attacked. In some way, it's like an immune system response against folks that are sandwiching. And the other thing that I would point out there is that like one of the arch sandwich bot operators was actually a miner exercising their transaction ordering rights of themselves. And like when the miner gets into the mix, there's not very much anyone can do about it. So I think you're on the spot that in some way it is a immune system response. The last thing that I would add there is that like I personally know a lot of these people, and some of them aren't necessarily doing it for some philosophical stance because they do these things themselves. They're just doing it for clout as well. To be able to like
At
go
the
on.
higher level, I mean, it almost doesn't matter, right? Because we're talking about, I know, sorry, Paul, we're going back to the system, but like the agents themselves emerging their behaviors, if they're doing it and the system has sort of rewarded the behavior of maintaining or sort of protecting, Ethereum is a really interesting culturally, like protecting the end user in a way that benefits the whole. Like the fact that the incentives are a mixture of financial and a mixture of clout and whatever we say it is, it's still like we still incentivized and produced that immune response behavior, even if we can't reduce it to, financial optimization on the part of the bot operator.
A question. Are these bots helping users on Ethereum?
So I think like Ethereum only runs and DeFi only works because of bot operators. Like ultimately the reason why prices are efficient is because there are arbitrage bot operators, and the reason why you can have like loan protocols is because people are liquidating them and et cetera. And so there is like this bit of activity of bots that is just central to how DeFi and Ethereum works.
Yeah.
And there are other activities that are just clearly like antisocial. They're extracting value from users.
So they're good bots and bad bots.
Yes, and it's very difficult to draw the line between what is good and what is bad. And I think the interesting thing here is that ultimately bots are just playing the rules of the game. So even the bad bots are just optimizing to a T on what the rules let them play. And in the cases where bot operators have like attacked other ones, it ends up being because someone is playing a game with different rules than what they thought. I think it's like the abstract.
What's interesting here is, just because we touched on this previously, if you had a protocol layer that was adjusting for what was best for users, so incentivizing the good bots to be more good and disincentivizing the bad bots.
How do you decide good bots and bad bots? The whole point was that was normative, right? Like it's not clear. There's the bot operators in this analogy, or not analogy, in this example, who are like making value judgments on whether the behavior is considered acceptable in their worldview. And then any clashing along those lines is I mean, obviously it emerges the platform that we use and love, but also like that intelligence is a social intelligence. It's a, that's not okay. I'm not going to have professional courtesy. I'm going to attack that bot. I really don't see how, at least in the near term, we pass that decision making to a machine.
Maybe just another question to you, Robert. Are there plans to DAOify these botnets, and essentially also make them potentially investable? That would be extremely interesting, because if you combine bots that have a certain, like, let's say, direction, and you enable them to self-replicate themselves by giving them resources and a clear directive, and make them investable, is that something that your community is beginning to discuss? Because then actually these botnets can become extremely powerful.
I mean, so sort of the best bot operators will never need your money, because like they're the best in the world at this are just printing money, millions of dollars from this. But like what I've discussed before has been whether or not DAOs will like allocate some of their treasury to have bot operators execute trades using their money. So you could have a non-custodial system like that, and that would be useful for like somebody that's starting off and doesn't have the capital themselves. But I think like it's very difficult to DAOify these bots in some way, because there's software that needs to run in a cloud to identify opportunities and then like craft the transactions and send them. And a bot that does that on chain will always strictly be worse than a bot that does that off chain, because ultimately these bots are competing on gas price and efficiency. And if you're doing all this computation on chain, then you're going to lose out to the person that does it in AWS and just uses the chain for execution.
So if you don't, I was gonna say, if you don't mind me commenting, I think that ties back though to these navigation problems, but not so much in the navigation of the whole system, but of the agent. I mean, if you look carefully at the way that these problems are, the smart contracts have the rules that you follow. There are these laws of motion. You have these action spaces that you can take, and you know, whenever we're solving for ARBs or various sort of sequencing of transaction problems, you always just look at them in terms of path planning. I'm a roboticist by formal training, so it's a literal path planning problem. You know the state of the system presently, at least insofar as you can observe it. You know the rules about changing, moving, and you can chain transactions to move to another point. You can measure the energy, and unlike in our physics, we can net positive on money if we can chain together a sequence of transactions that are net positive. And to a varying degree, we don't operate bots, but we design things in part for reducing the capacity for people to sequence things to create extractable opportunities. We look at sensitivities, very much a systems engineer, like, under what circumstances and to what extent is this going to be extractable, and kind of the opposite, honestly, of what you're doing with building bots. And obviously you can't get rid of it entirely, because in a decentralized system, you could end up with even just like a world of Uniswaps. You can imagine it getting out of sync, and to your earlier point, needing bots to function sort of like keepers to synchronize those oscillators, if you will. And what's really interesting to me about this discussion is actually again, it kind of goes back to the agent versus the system level properties, right? Like at the system level, all the people building all of these smart contracts are designing lots of little bits of state and little bits of rules about how you mutate state. And then we're composing them all together, creating this big, rich cyberspace, geography. And then you've basically got bots running paths. And as long as the paths that they're planning are net profitable, there's going to be minor extractable value. And in particular, to your earlier point, miners who can literally set the transaction order versus someone who's just racing to try to hopefully get this in the right spots. Anyway, so to kind of curb the tangent, the point I'm trying to make is actually the discussion isn't really a separate discussion. These are like two heads of the same coin. And one of the things that's interesting to me is this, in this biological analogy, I do tend to think of these bots, the dark forest, and then the systems and the rules, and then the higher order behavior of systems as big as, say, Ethereum, as just scales of the same organism, in the same way that I might look at the immune system in my body versus maybe my participation in this city or higher order community. And, I'm going to kind of punt back at Trent and make sure that he doesn't think that I overreached on the analogy, but I wanted to try to tie the stack together.
Oh, for sure. I agree. And by the way, I don't see it as an analogy to life. I see it as life, right? Life isn't restricted to just carbon, and it's, carbon is not a deity. But, to Paul's question and to Robert's answer of this idea of, can you somehow have a DAO or something to be doing these ARB bots and trading bots in general? And it's a really worthwhile question to ask and to pursue and treat as an engineering problem. And the reason it is because it could be a very good, at least partial answer to solving the MEV problem, right? Because imagine if you come up with some solution, a technology approach, where a bunch of people can invest in it, or maybe it's, let's say a bunch of people can invest in it. Thousands, tens of thousands of people have invested in it. And then it goes out, and those people also, there's a lot of resources to build basically the world's best, ARB bots, et cetera, right? And it can all be forked, et cetera, who knows, et cetera. But what if this thing gets so good that it's hard for the traditional bot runners to compete, right? And that is actually potentially super powerful, right? It's sort of like the vision of Numerai against the hedge funds. Ultimately Numerai might crush the hedge funds because it's just got the wisdom of the crowd. So what if you have the wisdom of the whole Ethereum crowd versus these individual bot runners and stuff, right? So what if this DAO, its profits got funneled directly back into, say, buying ETH in the open market and then burning ETH, right? So then you've actually aligned the interests of the whole Ethereum community with making this whole this whole trading system just amazing, right? And then, there's specific technical questions we solve, like, okay, yes, for sure, like off-chain stuff is always going to be faster than on-chain, but that's okay. Like there's ways to hook into that, right? To link on-chain and off-chain in various ways, right? Work at Ocean, work at Chainlink, work at Gnosis, and so on, where you can solve optimization problems in all you need offline, and then put it, or off-chain, and then put the answer on-chain, et cetera, and this is, for example, what Gauntlet is doing for Balancer DAO for minimizing impermanent loss is another example of some off-chain computation that way, right? Or true bit style stuff like just come out and so on. So I'm actually super excited about this as a direction, because I think it would be super cool for starters, right? We have this amazing emergent organism that's sort of this overlay on Ethereum mainnet and other networks that basically is the world's best trading system. And it's really, really hard to compete against, but you can contribute to it, get paid to contribute to it with your contributions, with the right incentive design, and it benefits the stakeholders, Ethereum stakeholders, and other potential contributors and stuff in other ways, right? So I'm super excited with that, and I've thought a lot about it, and it's definitely one of the sub-threads that Ocean is headed towards too, just because it makes so much sense.
And I think it's one of the things that's interesting here is this is a multi-layer game that's going on between users and bots, and then bots and like the ARC enemy. Nah, I shouldn't say enemy. The ARC rule makers of the system, which are ultimately miners. And Trent, I think that this is really interesting in the context of like users proposing the long tail of MEV extraction here. Because what we objectively see today in the bot ecosystem is that as more and more bots compete for more commodified opportunities like Uniswap to SushiSwap arbitrage, the profits that are captured by bot operators end up becoming smaller and smaller, and miners take home more and more. So today, somewhere between 90 to 99%, depending on the day, of profits from Uniswap to SushiSwap arbitrage goes to miners instead of bot operators. And it's like 80% for sandwich bot operators too. And eventually, because these things are actually not that complex, miners are going to run them themselves, or people will like bid it up to 99%, and miners will take home all of that. But for opportunities that are more long tail, for like more complex or more like obscure, maybe newer things, I think that's where increasingly opportunities for bot operators to capture MEV will be. And the question is how do you incentivize a group of people to do that together? And then the other question is for even non-commodified, for commodified opportunities like Uniswap arbitrage, is there some way in which bot operators can cooperate together in a DAO-like structure such that they don't bid their profits up to 100% to the miner, right? And ultimately, I think the answer to that is yes, because in order for miners to extract value, they need value being sent to them. Like users need to send them transactions. And so it seems to me that you could have some intermediary system that only sends transactions and like certain conditions.
How do you feel about aggregators, the likes of, say, 1inch, where, I mean, you're doing routing, you're solving the routing problem up front? Like, to what extent does volume going through that kind of system mitigate the arbitrage opportunities downstream?
They, like, to some extent, 1inch is like doing arbitrage for you in some way, because they're trying to find like the optimal path to go through, and you may capture some positive slippage there. But I think those can be kind of problematic if their incentives are misaligned. Like, there's a person that just did a $80,000 for $100 trade on 1inch, and like so they input $80,000 to the system and they got out 100. Some bug in 1inch. And you have to question, like, if 1inch, the DAO, is capturing that positive surplus, like, what do you think's going on there? Why does that keep on happening?
So taking it away from 1inch, then, though, I'll just frame it more at if the path planning problem becomes sufficiently commodity, why can't I move it to the edge software? So, like, I don't care if it's 1inch. Like, I want to make a trade. If it's a commodity to do a mixture of splits and routes in order to either capture or simply not create, right? Because on one hand, if I think of this just Uniswap world for a moment as a bunch of oscillators, they have, mass in the sense of some rotational inertia, and they have direction in the sense of price. And then obviously there's if I were, no gas fees and I have God's eye, I can just synchronize them all. It's not realistic, but we're all kind of perturbing them and they're bouncing around. There's still a sort of optimal in the moment action for my trade that sort of soaks up extra energy and doesn't induce extra energy. It's sort of the efficient path in the setting. And if I am currently just naively going to Uniswap or SushiSwap or whatever and trading, I'm probably just adding energy to this oscillator thing that's out of sync. But if instead I'm running let's ignore the aggregator as a service and just imagine that I have a piece of commodity software that does it for me in my own wallet even, then I simply, I want to swap. Well, what do? Well, I take the, instantaneously solved, locally solved optimal given my knowledge of the current state. And yeah, okay, it's still noisy. People are doing things concurrently. I'm not racing for order. So, it's still this stochastic problem, but ultimately, I'm envisioning a world where, we just inject less energy into that system. We stop perturbing them constantly and making lots of energy for, bots to soak out, and pass the path planning kind of piece to the edge, so that, again, we're just like injecting less energy into this. And it generalizes beyond the synchronized oscillators model that you would use if you're just thinking of Uniswaps and SushiSwaps, but only as much as the software that you would use is going to help you find your ideal path. You've basically said, I want to be in this state. I'm going to spend this much money. Path plan for me. And in a way, all I'm really describing is moving this beyond the scope of the bot runners into, and not necessarily into a DAO, but actually moving it all the way to the edge, at which point I guess you could think of it as the DAO, a DAO, but the DAO is now just the participants participating, because the software has allowed them to maybe just inject less free energy for bots to soak.
And I think that's the world that we're headed towards, is like natively within MetaMask. I think they do this today. And on sort of the back end, I think you'll see miners and bot operators, whichever ends up running these bots, will be constantly bringing the oscillations into sync on chain, such that the aggregators are basically only placing according to the liquidity that each pool has, and, like, I don't know, the nuances of their price curves or whatnot.
To the AI level, the really hard, the really hard synchronization bits, but the commodity ones can flow to the edges.
Yeah.
I want to bring it back a little bit, and just also looking at kind of maybe at the time that's left. So I think there's two big movements at the moment that could give the real rise to like AI DAO experimentation at an agent level. And I think we need to test these things out MVP style. And the cool thing with, so there's two big movements. One is NFTs, and we just discussed a lot of components around DeFi, that they create incentive layers. I think one of the first incentivized, for me that seemed very feasible, AI DAO implementations was an art DAO. Given the current NFT craze, would actually be a very interesting real life example to begin implementing. So essentially an art DAO would be an DAO that owns a specific AI algorithm that creates NFT art pieces and begins selling them and then begins self-optimizing them. Trent, you could probably describe that a lot better. And then maybe as a question to lead on to that, what could be some easy wins that we could start as a community for people to begin experimenting more with these concepts? Because I think that's really a point where we're at. I think we have a lot of the tools to begin building small use cases. Yeah.
Why
Zargham?
create rather than buy and sell? I mean, the problem with create there is that the loop doesn't really close. You have to engage with the people. If you just imagined an MVP art DAO, I would do it as a collection, so that you basically monitored some number of auction sites. Relatively few would be required. Really, you could probably just do OpenSea. You apply some algorithm to effectively think of it as a price regressor, and you could observe some of the data you literally get records in the form of past sales and any whatever metadata feature you build. So you build a model of what things are worth. Maybe you suck, maybe you don't, but you can create a training set from the available data. Then for anything that's on sale, you effectively apply the regressor, you come up with a value, you bid up, you follow a bidding strategy up to what you currently value at. Maybe you even revise your belief of what it's worth based on the trajectory of the auction, and then you either buy or don't buy, and you continue to reevaluate your collection. And if a regressor returns that something in your collection is worth enough that you would want to put it on sale again, but you literally just manage a set of NFTs. Like if you really wanted to play with the minimalist MVP, I feel like you'd probably just seed it with a small collection, you'd seed it with some funds, and you would teach it to effectively feature engineer based on the metadata that's available in potentially something like OpenSea. You would train the regressor with new data every time you saw new events related to buying and selling, and then you would buy and sell stuff. And there's a real risk here that this bot would get effed by people who went and screwed with it, but you'd learn a lot in the process.
Yeah, but so for example, this is the stuff that we need to, maybe one of us, let's write this out as a tweet afterwards and like just put it out there. Because like if someone starts doing this, that's how stuff actually happens and gets done.
Yeah, there's a few
except for they're going to lose money, almost certainly.
Yeah, there's a few different things that are getting close to, like Alethea AI is doing these INFTs, which is putting a bit of AI intelligence inside NFTs, quite narrow.
You get these super weird interactions now with your NFTs, which is like, it's absolutely fascinating.
That's actually super fun. But like the way that I view like crypto art, normally people buy it, collect it, and it just kind of sits there. It doesn't interact that much with other stuff. There's some exceptions, but with DeFi, it's sort of building on building on building. So there's a lot more richness for emergence of intelligence, and that's where we're going to get like the super interesting results, right? And emergence in like the John Holland sense, Marvin Minsky sense, et cetera, right? So I see NFTs as very useful for people to, submit algorithms that can be trading strategies, the way that people can give strategies to Yearn, or Renaissance Technologies, one of the most successful hedge funds ever. Their game was basically submitting different trading strategies to their overall trading system too, right? So I see like, NFTs for art is going to be cool, and maybe there's some low-hanging fruit, there certainly is, but for DeFi and trading, it's so much more interesting. And I want to just come back to this because there was talk about making this commodified and putting it on the edge and stuff. I see it could go the other direction, where if you have where it could get crazy complex in a sort of a cool way where it'll be almost untouchable, where you have this system that has tons and tons and tons of bots, and you can't even understand them. And this is the background I come from. I come from where I was using things like genetic programming to evolve analog circuits that that would do things that no one had ever seen before, designs, right? And it wasn't, in the community that I was in, people were doing this not just for circuits, but also, a friend of mine, he's not a quantum computing expert at all, but he actually wrote a textbook of quantum computing designs because he evolved them all and they were like best in the world. So why not, right? And so I see that we can be evolving trading bots because they are kind of this weird combination of nonlinear sub blocks that you don't really know how they work together. But if you have evolution putting them together, you're going to get crazy complicated stuff. And if you have some sort of overall, DAO-ish mechanism to coordinate them and put them into a trading system, that's super powerful, right? And it can have some pretty strong moats, especially if, you know, the Ethereum community is helping to drive it, because it helps to drive ETH and get rid of the MEV that's going just to the individuals, right? So I'm very bullish on that. You know, so that's not low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of work to be done on that, but it's very exciting. But definitely, I'm all for the low-hanging fruit too.
You have in that mental model too, though, you got to be careful about what you're, you know, using. I guess when we talked earlier about the novelty search, where it's interesting to just search for novel strategies, but ultimately you need an objective for these bots. Otherwise, we go back to our Bostrom problem, right? If you get these super untouchable evolutionary computer MEV bots, do we have to fork Ethereum again to get away from them? Like, if they end up doing something we don't like?
I've actually asked myself that question, and I actually would view it as a sign of success that we would have to fork Ethereum mainnet because these things ran out of control. That would be a good problem to have.
But like if you have the Arch bot here, which just takes state and performs any state function to try and find value, that is, if you were really able to create that, then there's no way you could ever fork that out, because that's like some off-chain computation getting all these values.
That's true. And by the way, like evolution of code, it works better closer to the machine. So evolving EVM bytecode will work better than evolving Solidity, for example, right?
Well,
I had a
question this forking thing though. Even if the bot exists outside of the code, one could imagine that it's, again, maybe it's an oversimplification, but if the world that it knows about is the Ethereum blockchain and it gets exceptionally good at it, even if it lives, you know, it's kind of, think of its sensors and actuators as attached to the Ethereum blockchain, even if its brain is in the cloud. Then
if I can add one thing exactly on, wait, if I can add one thing exactly on that. So when the DAO first came, there was this concept of child DAOs. And if you combine that with AI, it gets really interesting because you get to self-replicate the system, and the best child DAOs, child AI DAOs would survive. But now, just touching on what you said, Zargham, they need gas costs. So once they run out of gas, they die. Or once they run out of ETH, they die. So now it's survival of the fittest. They constantly need to earn ETH in order to survive, which is, I find that extremely fascinating.
That's why they're
why do I keep using energy as the analogy for ETH? It's because in the life analogy, or in the life example, to give Trent, right? Okay, life. Well, what's energy in this system? It's ETH, because you need to go out and eat in order to have energy, in order to perform activities. It's literally energy. But the caveat here is that there's a big difference between accumulating arbitrary energy and having enough energy to live. So ecologically speaking, if a life form consumes too much energy, it starves the ecosystem it lives in and kills it. So when we talk about this in bioanalogy, it actually really helps us look at sustainability and not necessarily want ultimately perfect extractors, because if the perfect extractor is perfect, they will kill the environment they live in, and then they'll, okay, cool, I have all the energy. Great. No one cares.
I mean, even in your example, Trent, of having this DAO that optimizes for like buying more and more ETH and burning it. And initially the Ethereum community is like, yay, it's working. And it just gets better and better. It starts acquiring all of the ETH and burning it. I guess that it would also like, then we would have to fork it out.
Yeah, if we can, like Robert pointed out, maybe we can't, right? So, but I think it's really healthy that we ask these questions, because it feels like science fiction now, but half a year from now or 2 years from now, it won't be. Just like the Dark Forest stuff a year ago, 2 years ago, felt more like science fiction, you know, thinking about it, or the precursors, right? And it became possible once DEX has had enough volume, right? Because if you think about hedge funds and stuff in the past, they didn't interact with each other very much, because it was, you know, there was no opportunities. But now that we have sufficient trading volume in a decentralized way, and the opportunity for these life forms on the substrates, we're in a whole new territory, right? And like, this is by far the most interesting substrate for AI that the world has ever seen, right?
Because it introduces for me this concept of survival of the fittest, which is very natural. It's how evolution really brought us.
And by the way, it doesn't even have to be the fittest. It's a bit more what Zargham was hinting at, which is, you know, if you have enough energy or gas to keep making babies, you will. But if you suck sufficiently bad, then you die off, right? Maybe it's only like the 10% worst that die off, but the rest keep making babies and stuff, right? And that's actually kind of the framing of novelty search too. So it's not trying to optimize an objective function. It's just more like, can you get past some minimum baseline to keep making babies? Right.
This is super important, actually. I want to talk about it some more. So the framing of survival of the fittest, the one that's most commonly discussed, is not very good, because actually, like, again, to the point of, well, I got all the points. It's not how biology works. You need to meet minimum constraints for persistence and survival. But then when you look forward, not in the past, you need to be diverse enough to be able to absorb shocks or changes to the world. So in practice, you don't just have like, oh, let me look at the past and score up how I did, and let's just persist the ones that score the best and collapse the gene pool to hyper optimize around the things that performed really great, because the real world is noisy and messy and complex, and the future is different from the past. So you actually have to have a more like your first order constraints are persist. I need to score well enough to collect the energy to keep living and keep playing. Great, 100%. But that places what we normally think of as fitness, an objective, in the role of constraint. And the novelty search and some of the other more interesting, kind of newer stuff around trying to discover new and interesting combinations of survivable things is essentially what emerges. You get this, the objective is find new stuff that scores well enough on fitness to not die, as opposed to, or a better co-fit with the other things that are existent. But like really thinking about survival of the fittest is really helpful, but it's really only a starting point. Using it as a magic wand will get you in trouble.
Guys, I want to be respectful of everyone's schedule, and thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Should continue this in some form, and maybe I think there's really a community to build around this, and I think it's the convergence that we're seeing, like of multiple sectors, even within the Web3 space. And with that, I want to hand it over back to Stephen.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much. I mean, for me, I'm still a rookie in all this AI and DAO. And I mean, even them combining, that's a complete new world anyway. And I think there is an audience out there who is also in the same state as I am. So thank you for talking about this today, and I hope that I can maybe contribute a bit more in the future. Future episodes if we're going to talk about AI again and DAOs, and have some questions as well. And I will go and listen and watch these podcasts over and over again, because I think I truly need it still. Yeah, thank you so much.